Welcome back, vintage gamers. It is the end of the year. 2023 is over, and I thought now would be a pretty good time to go back and see what happened in vintage over the year. Talk about the major tournament, who won, what decks were performing. I think we'll go quarter by quarter and check out the deck trends over the course of the year, culminating in a full data review for the whole year. What decks were the best? What decks actually underperformed? See as new decks arrived in the middle of the format. I think we'll take a look at the data in terms of player data. We'll look at the MTGO leaderboard that I've created using the data we have, and just honor some of our more powerful wizards for their performances this year. And then I think we'll do like a little end of the year awards, little so many insane plays style, where I just want to make my argument for the deck of the year and the new card of the year, probably. There actually are some really good choices in both of those categories, and it's worth talking about the major archetypes and what they brought to the format over the course of the year. So, without further ado, let's dive into 2023. Quarter one in 2023 started off with a bang, with the Vintage Showcase happening in January. The Vintage Showcase is a series of 3 events that happen in quarter one of every year, culminating in a 24-ish player invite-only qualifier event that puts a vintage player into the mocks. It also puts a vintage player onto the Pro Tour. So as of this year, at least, that is the only way you can qualify for the Pro Tour directly by playing vintage. Winning a showcase qualifier puts you into the mocks with a huge prize pool, multi-format suite, invite-only tournament, and invite to the Pro Tour. So this year, we had a showcase in January, a showcase in February, and a showcase in March. So starting in January, we had our first showcase of the year. It was an 149 players event. It was won by Brian Palace and Rashida on Doomsday. That's his preferred deck on Magic Online, and the year started off with a big win for Doomsday. I'll show you on the side of the screen. Hopefully it'll be nice and large enough to at least parse, but I'll talk through the data too. What I did is I just threw up the metagame breakdown and event win rates by sub-archetype. And so you'll see me talk a lot about some of these decks. Initiative, combo shops, I'll probably call combo shops or Jewel. Countervine, I might call Countervine or Squee. But what we had in this deck, this tournament, I should say, is the most played decks were Initiative, Jeskai, Countervine, and Agrovine, with a smattering of other decks in a pretty widely played amount. And the best performing decks at this tournament was actually Oath. Oath and Agrovine were the 2 best performing decks at this tournament. It was won by Doomsday, which had obviously a very good showing. But it's actually pretty interesting because this is Oath before Atraxa was printed. So this is the traditional old school style, not old school style, but like pre-Atraxa Oath, which I think is actually quite different from the Oath decks you're seeing play now in December. So pretty interesting, a way to kick off the year. And we'll end up seeing this a lot over the course of quarter one and quarter two. Doomsday puts up some serious numbers. It is definitely worth mentioning that the most played decks at this tournament, being Initiative and Jeskai, is definitely a thing for the start of the year. However, Initiative has basically been the most played deck over almost all the quarters, and we'll probably see that as the tournaments continue to break down. So, first tournament of the year, 149 players, won by Doomsday. Now, we did get some other really awesome high stakes MTGO events in the first half of the year or so. And that happened in January with a vintage Super RCQ. So a Super RCQ is a regional championship qualifier event held on Magic Online, where the top 2 players of the event get to go to their region's RCQ, which is a large tournament that qualifies for the Pro Tour. So these used to be PTQs online that would queue you directly for the Pro Tour. I won a couple of those. That's how I got to play some of the Arena Pro Tours. But these are the Super RCQs, so a preliminary qualifier event, but they are usually a pretty high prize pool and are considered, higher stakes vintage events on Magic Online, and they bring in a good crowd as well. So 164 players in the first Super RCQ in January. This RCQ was won by former streamer Ryan Wingtasar. who was playing Countervine, and Hank the Obese, so Lee Webb, who was on Mono White Initiative. This is probably one of the first bigger events that Hank the Obese won with Mono White Initiative, but really kind of innovated that archetype across multiple formats. So pretty, I think, important historical tournament here. Most played decks, as you can see. Initiative was by far the most played deck in this tournament. This January is coming right off the heels of Initiative's introduction to Magic Online. Initiative was placed onto Magic Online late in 20, like the end of November of 2022. And it really sprung onto the scene in Vintage, where it was starting to dominate originally in the beginning. It was really dominating events and putting up huge play rates and huge win rates. Over the course of the year, you'll see, although Initiative no longer put up the win rates, it still puts up these very high play rates. And so it was the most played deck at this tournament, and didn't fare super well. The best performing decks at this tournament were actually traditional old school PO, not jewel shops, like actual factual, like Esper and Mono Blue saga based PO decks. Had a really good tournament here from Prison Shops as well. Countervine had a nice one as well. So those are like some interesting decks actually to feast on an Initiative field. PO and most combo decks are pretty good against Initiative typically, so that kind of makes sense to me. And then I have a note here that the next major thing that happened was not a tournament, but the next major occurrence was All Will Be One, releasing in the beginning of February. The reason All Will Be One is important is because All Will Be One does contain Atraxa, the Grand Unifier. Atraxa, the Grand Unifier, is going to be a major storyline and mover and shaker of the format in 2023. So, moving into February, we have the February showcase, 149 players, and this is actually a really interesting one as well because it's won by Storm Guy Is Me. Storm Guy Is Me is one of the, I believe, is one of the members of an Italian MTG team, and this I don't want to say ruined. Ruined is not the right word. This win really shook up the format for a good few months because what Storm Guy Is Me won with was Initiative Tinker. So this was a hybrid deck that combined the Mono White Initiative deck with some of the Esper Tinker style decks. And it really made a pretty large dent in the format for a couple months. And so this was a format or a showcase that had a lot of Initiative and a lot of Countervine as the main decks, with Jeskai, Doomsday, and Oath following up. And the best decks for this tournament were actually Dredge and Doomsday. So get some early powerful performances here from Dredge and Doomsday, which actually end up being pretty reasonable choices across the whole year in terms of battling random Initiative metagames. So yeah, this is an important tournament for sure because the Initiative Tinker deck, while never really like solidifying itself over the whole year as a deck of choice in Vintage, it did have a couple months where it was extremely high played and did fairly well. To its credit, it was able to really capitalize on the surprise factor of having the two different game plans for sure. Moving from February into March, you have the third and final showcase of 2023, 161 players. This one was won by Vintage Mox competitor in the past, Fanoop, Pete Ward, on Mono Blue Saga PO. That was always Pete's, pet deck, special build. No one really had the same success that he did with that deck, but it was always really cool watching that deck get played. So this was another Initiative tournament right here. Almost 30 players on Initiative, with some pretty high numbers of Esper Saga, Countervine. I mean, this is a pretty balanced. What's this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The first deck is 30, but the rest of these decks are between 10 and 15, all the way down to like 8th. So pretty wide field in this March showcase. And the decks that performed really well in this one are actually combo shops, jewel shops. Really high, nice win rate. Jewel Shops you're gonna see Jewel Shops have a pretty strong year, and one of the big reasons is because Jewel Shops is one of the absolute best decks against Initiative, and if Initiative is gonna be your most played deck on Magic Online, of course, play some combo. Initiative actually had a pretty good tournament in this one, even though it had almost 30 players. It still had above 50% win rate, so pretty strong tournament from Initiative. So keeping those in mind and combining all the other challenges from quarter one. From quarter one, we have the full data here from quarter one. It makes sense that Initiative is by far the most played deck, almost twice as much as the second most played deck. But Doomsday being the second most played deck and having an extremely high win rate, 53.63 is definitely a high win rate over a large data set. Something to keep in mind when we talk about like the complete year data and decks that have performed very well. You see another deck that had about the same win rate, but just a slightly less play rate. Jewel had a really nice time in this Initiative heavy field. So you're looking here at Jewel and Doomsday as your best choices and the best performing decks inside of quarter one in a metagame that was pretty dominated by, in the sense, play rates. The play rates were simply lots and lots of Initiative. So yeah, I would say it's a little bit, these are pretty much similar win rates. So when someone has, 60 or 50, I should say, more players played than the other, I would give the Doomsday as the best deck of quarter one, and Jewel as a close second or tied. Okay, in April now, in quarter two, there were only two major events, and only one is a major event in terms of number of players. The first major event was the Showcase Qualifier, which is definitely an important event. 26 players in this one, invite only. Winner goes to the Mox and the Pro Tour. While the metagame doesn't matter too much in one of these kind of small invite-only tournaments, the winning deck list can definitely influence the metagame for months to come. And the winner of the Showcase Qualifier in 2023 was Moon Madness. Actually more, I think, the legacy player, but kind of entered into Vintage, got a Showcase top 8, using the skills they carried over from the Initiative deck and Legacy. So congratulations to Moon Madness on being the Vintage representative in the Mox and the Pro Tour in 2023. It was actually a pretty impressive win, considering Initiative was a deck with a target on its back. And even, considering they won the tournament, Initiative still had less than 50% win rate. So the other players who played Initiative did not do as well as Moon Madness did. In April, there was a super qualifier, 186 players, won by Loriwa and Lori. Why are these names so similar? Loriwa, Prison Shops aficionado, was able to split the finals of this tournament with his pet deck right there. And then the other deck that won the event was Blue Black Tinker featuring Shieldred. So that's a pretty important inclusion from All Will Be One back in February. However, probably not as impactful as Atraxa on the format overall. This was another field that had lots and lots of Initiative, and even more Initiative than normal. As you can see, the most played deck was Initiative, and the second most played deck was Initiative Tinker, following Stormguy Izmi's Showcase win back in February. Initiative Tinker definitely kept some steam heading all the way in through April. However, both those decks didn't have, I wouldn't say amazing. I mean, Initiative Tinker did very poorly, but Initiative did very well, actually. Just above 50% win rate as the deck with the most players and the big target on its back. So you got to give credit to Initiative for being able to take a nice solid win rate inside this field, even if it's not going to take down one of the two RCQ spots. So Initiative, in the field of Initiative Tinker, Jewel, Countervine, and Doomsday, pretty impressive actually showing for Initiative in this specific Super RCQ. Those were the only real major events in April, so we can take a look at the quarter two total data here. Take a quick peek at quarter two, and you see we've got Initiative. Initiative is the most played deck in quarter two of 2023. Actually only followed very closely by Jewel/Combo Shops. So the two major players in quarter two were Initiative and Jewel, and then a bunch of players on Doomsday, Oath, Prison Shops, Dredge, and Countervine, and Initiative Tinker following those up. You have to look at the data here and say, you got to give it to Doomsday. Doomsday, well, yeah, I'll take that back. Let's give it to Jewel as the best deck in quarter two. Jewel did have, 52-ish% win rate, slightly better win rate for the Doomsday pilots, but I mean, 80 less players, considering Jewel versus Doomsday. You're going to have to say best deck in quarter two, Jewel, followed by Doomsday. And then you also got to give Countervine a shout out here. Countervine had a little bit less players than both of those decks, but it's still a pretty solid win rate in quarter two. Combining our quarter one and quarter two data into a half year total data here, you can see obviously Initiative Tinker is far and away the most played deck over the course of the first half of the year, followed by Jewel, Doomsday, Countervine, Oath, and Jeskai still lingering around from the start of the year. So big Initiative and Jewel metagame for the first half of the year, and you really do have to think and look and see, well, actually almost as many Doomsday players as Jewel players. That is definitely influence from quarter one as compared to quarter two. And at this point, a full percent higher this time for Doomsday. So let's say, yeah, I would say the best deck of the first half of 2023 was Doomsday, which is really funny because right now Doomsday is not a highly favored deck in terms of metagame. But in the first half of the year, Doomsday was the third most played deck and the highest win rate deck among the most played decks. So Doomsday, your number one deck in the first half of 2023. Jewel, your second highest in 2023 first half. And then you probably go down to, I would say, Dredge at the seventh most played, 51% win rate. So you give it to Dredge as number three. So first half of the year, gold medal to Doomsday, silver medal to Jewel, and third bronze medal to Dredge. Before moving on to quarter three, there's an important stopping point here in June. Lord of the Rings is released onto Magic Online and paper. Lord of the Rings was a very high power set, bringing cards like the One Ring and Orcish Bowmaster, but probably what will end up being the most impactful card from Lord of the Rings is actually Lorien Revealed, the common land cycler that is blue and draws cards. If you want to know more about Lorien Revealed, I have a really cool video in the Voice of Vintage series that talks all about how Lord of the Rings and Lorien Revealed in particular has changed the Vintage metagame completely. It is interesting that in quarter three, we don't have any major events. I really would like to start spreading these out and having multiple super RCQs during the year, but I understand that Magic Online has only a certain number of super RCQs they're allowed to use, and so there's some concerns there. But when you don't have showcases, if you don't have super RCQs, you end up with just challenges. So we're going to take a quick look at the quarter three data for challenges on Magic Online. And we'll take a look and see how the metagame has differed back from quarter two. So in quarter two, you remember we had Initiative, Jewel, Doomsday, Oath, and Prison Shops. Here in quarter three, the most played deck, still Initiative. We've got Initiative, 187 players, and then followed by Doomsday, Combo Shops, Oath, and that's like it for your major most played decks. Then you have a couple other things like Ring decks are popping up, Bug decks, Countervine decks still have some Initiative Tinker running around. But this is a pretty interesting quarter three in my mind because none of like these major played decks did very well. They did okay, you know, some of them had a slightly over 50% win rate, but the most played deck that actually had a pretty solid win rate ended up being decks like Bug and Initiative Tinker. Now these play rates are not high, especially in comparison to things like Initiative. Bug has a third of the players that Initiative had, but you know, slightly over 50% win rate for Bug, and then Initiative Tinker with like 52% or so. You have to go all the way down here to something like Aggro Shops to see a really strong win rate. When you have Aggro Shops at almost 55% win rate, but you know, only 45 players. You will see this start to pop up in the back half of the year with some of these smaller decks having the ability to exploit the field in pretty meaningful ways. It is also worth noting, if you go further down in this data, with only 40 pilots, the beginning of Luris Saga. Now, this is a deck that will pop up in quarter four, but basically it took a little while for Luris Saga to get going, people to figure out how to use Lorien Revealed to offset Urza Saga's mana issues. And you see actually a really solid win rate right off the bat with Luris Saga. So this is the beginning of Luris Saga in quarter three, but Luris Saga doesn't really kick off until quarter four. Quarter four is one of our most populated months in terms of major tournaments. However, most of them won't actually end up inside of the data sheet. We'll go over that a little bit more when we get to the Eternal Weekend events. But we did start off quarter 4 with a new set, Wilds of Eldraine, in the beginning of September. So I guess that had at least one important card, right? Beseech the Mirror. Beseech the Mirror, pretty important because it actually basically established its own archetype. Now, it's not a new archetype. The Storm style deck has existed in Vintage for a long time, but it's really, really waned in the past few years. When I started playing Vintage, many players would be playing Dark Petition Storm, but actually stronger blue-based combo decks like Paradoxical Outcome kind of pushed Dark Petition Storm out of the format, as Dark Petition Storm couldn't really play Force of Will. These Beseech the Mirror decks do have enough cards to play Force of Will. Maybe that's also a lot in part because of Lorien Revealed's printing. But between Lorien Revealed and Beseech the Mirror, we have a whole new Storm deck entering the equation. So quarter 4 kicks off with a major online event in a RCQ. 159 players in this RCQ, and the first major win for Lurrus Saga in the hands of Duke 12. Duke 12, very powerful, fair Magic aficionado on Magic Online. Always does well with different kind of Lurrus controlling decks, even before Saga was incorporated into those shells. And so here you actually see a major tournament where Initiative is not the most played deck. Initiative is still a lot heavily played, 20 players out of 159, but the most played deck does end up being Lurrus Saga. Now, this is like the very beginning of Urza Saga's rise to power in the Vintage format. Urza Saga, Lurrus, Urza Saga, and Oath of Druids being two very, very major players. Oath had just started to be used as a way to really counter the Initiative metagame, and especially Oath was a way to counter the initial Lurrus Saga builds. The initial Lurrus Saga builds were blue-black, and those decks were not super well equipped to deal with Oath. So you actually see that this is a major tournament where Oath basically is just super dominant. 60% win rate as the second most played deck. And Beseech the Storm also down here with 54% win rate. That's definitely a lot less play rate, though. So you have to give this tournament. This tournament is an Oath tournament through and through. A great pick to capitalize on an Initiative and Lurrus Saga metagame, especially with these Lurrus Saga decks being in the beginning of their creation and still kind of narrow in their application. So with this RCQ concluding, and Lurrus Saga and Oath and Initiative being the major metagame players, we move into the 3 Eternal Weekend events in Europe, Asia, and North America. Now, these events don't get included into the data dashboard, and the reason I have for that is because these are paper events, but not only are they paper events, they are paper no proxy events, which create all kinds of constraints in terms of deck selection. And I don't think it makes sense to, one, include paper events at all inside of a full MTGO data set. And 2, I definitely don't want to include paper events that are no proxy, because there are just too many decks that are chosen based on money constraints. However, I do think it is important to look at the data and analyze what was happening inside of these events, because they are important on shaping the Magic Online and paper metagames moving forward. So we'll start with Europe. An Eternal Weekend in Europe, in Prague, there was 125 players, and the trend over these 3 events is that the most played deck will end up being Oath of Druids. So no longer is the target on Initiative's back, and the target is not yet on Lurrus Saga's back in paper. Oath of Druids is the deck to beat at these tournaments. And so you move into this Oath of Druids event with 125 players, and it is actually won by, very randomly, Esper Saga. Lucas Schwendinger on Esper Saga, very powerful performance, and was able to capitalize on this Oath field with some nice things like Fragmentize and that kind of stuff. Oath was the most played, with Countervine and Lurrus Saga following up. There was a pretty heavy presence of Jewel, some random blue control decks, and Beseech. And you do have to say the best performing deck at this tournament is actually going to be Beseech. Of the decks that have a high play percentage, Beseech has a very, very high win rate. And you're going to actually see Beseech do very well in these tournaments because it's actually quite well positioned against Oath and Initiative and those kind of decks. So even though Jewel, which was might have a better tournament for these other Eternal weekends, Jewel had a horrendous tournament at Europe. For whatever reason, Jewel just bombed out, while Beseech Initiative actually did pretty well. Luris Saga did pretty well. Even Oath of Druids, which was the most played deck and the deck with a target on it back, still finished above 51%. So lots of strong performances from those decks. When you go to Asia, the field almost doubles. In Japan, there were 201 players. And as you can see, another Oath tournament. Lots of Oath players in this event. Oath is the deck to beat. And actually, Oath takes this one down. Daisuke Hirasawa on Oath of Druids wins this event. There were many Luris Saga players, Jewel players, Initiative players, Dredge players, and Countervine players. With Luris Saga definitely taking the cake as the deck of the tournament. Something to note over the break between Eternal Weekend Europe all the way to Eternal Weekend NA, the Luris Saga decks actually change. The Luris Saga decks were blue-black initially, and they actually start moving towards more of a blue-white style, getting to play things like Containment Priest and Fragmentize and Cathar Commando, Seal of Cleansing, cards that are very, very good against Oath of Druids. So keep an eye on Luris Saga over the course of these couple events. Very important. So yeah, good event from Luris Saga. Good event from Beseech. Again, Beseech was not a heavily played deck, only 9 players, but a very, very strong win rate from Beseech. Actually, a pretty strong tournament for Jewel this time, 53% win rate as the 3rd most played deck is definitely a big Jewel performance. Interesting to note that in this tournament, Bug was the 7th most played deck and had a nice high win rate. Bug keeps popping up every now and then. It's a deck that has really fallen off of the Magic Online metagame, but every so often you see a format get a little bit too artifact combo centric, and all of a sudden Bug just has a random tournament win. No win here, but a 52% win rate as the 7th most played is definitely nothing to scoff at. And then the final Eternal Weekend deck and the large tournament and the largest tournament of the year for Vintage, 385 players in Pittsburgh in the US to play no proxy Vintage, which is just wild and blows my mind. And a 3rd tournament in a row where the deck to beat is Oath of Druids, 70 players out of 385 players, with huge meta shares for Countervine, Luris Saga, and Initiative. The talk of this event is absolutely Jewel. This tournament is won by Anthony Valentine on Jewel, and Jewel had a extremely high top 8 presence. Jewel had almost a 60% win rate as the 5th most played deck. So definitely this is a tournament that really got people talking about Jewel. Worth noting in this tournament, Dredge also had an extremely high win rate. Dredge wasn't the most played deck by any means, but had a very strong performance. Beseech quietly again, this time as the 6th most played deck, another strong performance. And then Luris Saga as the 3rd most played deck, another 53% win rate performance, this time with a lot of players shifting over to the blue-white or Esper versions of the deck. Finally, quarter 4 data. Reminder, of course, that this is quarter 4 data for Magic Online only. So this includes the RCQ, but not any of the Eternal Weekend events. In quarter 4, it is the first time in the year that Initiative is not the most played deck. The most played deck in the end of the year is Luris Saga. 244 matches of players of Luris Saga, I should say. 172 Initiative, 155 Oath. So that rounds up your top 3 decks. And then you also have 118 Jewel and 89 Beseech. A pretty well-defined 5-deck major meta share. You do have a bunch of other decks around here at less, but pretty defined at the top of the metagame. And this is actually a pretty staggering number here. Luris Saga was the most played deck in quarter 4 on Magic Online, and Luris Saga had the highest win rate among most played decks at 54%, almost 54.5%. So basically an extremely strong performance from Lura Saga, by far the best deck in quarter 4 on Magic Online. Initiative really struggling into the new field. Though Oath and Jewel both had very strong performances. Jewel had a better one. For a while, actually, it was a little bit of a Jewel metagame following Jewel's win. Not even following Jewel's win, even a little bit before Jewel's win in paper in North America. Jewel was kind of the deck to beat on Magic Online. It wasn't obviously the most played deck here. There was lots of Lura Saga running around, but Jewel definitely had a really, just like a couple months of really strong performances. So I think definitely Lura Saga, the deck to talk about in quarter 4, followed by Jewel and Oath. By finishing quarter 4, we finished the second half of the year. Let's combine quarter 3 and quarter 4 and take a look at the second half of the year's data. You have kind of a smaller data set than the first half of the year, considering there were just a lot less online tournaments. But Initiative is the most played deck in the second half of 2023, followed by Lura Saga. A big rise in Lura Saga, considering the deck was basically only seen in quarter 4. There was a little bit in quarter 3, but almost entirely based on its quarter 4 play rate. Lura Saga followed by Oath, still very high play rate for Oath, and Jewel and Doomsday actually quietly as the 5th most played deck here in the second half of the year. Looking at the win rates here, definitely a Lura Saga second half of the year. Getting the second most played while only being mostly in quarter 4 and continuing to have a 54, almost 55% win rate. Lura Saga is definitely the deck to think about in terms of the second half of 2023. When you move further down here, I think something to take a little peek at is Aggro Shops. Aggro Shops is pretty far down in this list of most played, maybe somewhere around 10th. But nice strong win rate here for Aggro Shops. I keep hearing, when it's a small community, there are loud players. And some loud players will tell you, man, Bazaar is so bad in Vintage now. Man, Shops is so unplayable in Vintage now. And this is just not true. This is just not the case. Dredge and Aggro Shops had a really strong second half of the year. Decent play rates and over 50% win rates. The meta share of decks like sphere-based workshop decks and Bazaar decks is definitely lower than it has been in the past for Vintage, but that's not even a bad thing. These decks are still present in the format, and they're still metagame players and very important to the field. That being said, it is definitely a Lurrus and Urza Saga dominated second half of the year, though nice actual win rate here for Oath of Druids at the third most played, 51%. And then even a little further down, things like Beseech had a pretty reasonable showing as well. Jewel kind of falls off a little bit compared to some of its like smaller month-to-month subset numbers, only about a 51% win rate for Jewel. When we take the second half of the year data and we combine it to the full year data, we get to take our outlook on 2023. Obviously, the number one most played deck in Vintage in 2023 is Mono White Aggro, which is a crazy thing to say after 2022, where, I mean, I did win the last tournament of 2022, I guess, but it's been a very long time. I can't remember a time where an aggro deck, not a non-shops aggro deck even, was the most played deck in Vintage for a year. So, and it's not close. It's by a lot. 849 players compared to the second most played deck, Jewel Combo Shops at 517. Initiative, yeah, your most played deck of 2023 is Initiative. It's not going to be your best deck of 2023 because it only has around a 50% win rate. But you do have a couple reasonable choices here. Second most played deck, Jewel, being 52% win rate is very, very impressive. Oath had a good year at 51% win rate as well, third most played. And then Doomsday, which, not the most played deck inside of the second half of the year, even. Actually, I think the fifth most played deck in the second half of the year, but not like a deck people are talking about in the second half of the year. Doomsday ends the year with fourth most played in basically the same amount as Oath, and a very high win rate to boot, 52%. When you go down the list, you pass by Countervine, and you get to the decks that were played around 200, 300, or more, I say around 300 times. And then you have the very clear outlier performer here in Lurrus Saga. It's worth really noting that most of Lurrus Saga's wins, or matches, I should say, have happened in quarter 4. So to be the 6th most played deck and only really exist for a fourth of the year, almost, maybe a little bit more than a fourth of the year, is pretty impressive. And of course, the win rate we saw in the second half of the year, which encompasses basically the full year win rate for Lurrus Saga, because it's not present in the first half of the year, sticks. So Lurrus Saga ends up being your highest win percentage deck among decks that have a high enough play rate. I don't know if I would say that makes it the best deck of the whole year. It's definitely the best deck in the back half of the year, or even the back quarter of the year. But when you have these decks like Jewel, Oath, maybe less so Oath, but Jewel, Oath, and Doomsday that have, almost double the play rate, maybe a little bit less than double the play rate of Lurrus over the whole year, putting up numbers like 52%. Tough to say. But yeah, for sure, your 3 decks, I think, that define winning in 2023 are Lurrus Saga, Jewel, and Doomsday. Those are your 3 decks of 2023 in terms of strong choices over the whole year. Taking a look at the whole year data, I think it's important to recognize some of the players who performed extremely well over the year. I think it's nice to shout out players who have put in a lot of effort and, give them the recognition they deserve. So what I'm going to do is take a look at the leaderboard sheets that I have on the Databoard dashboard. Yeah, those are words. And we're going to take 4 categories here. We're going to look at most matches played. We're going to look at most top 8s. We're going to look at best win rate over at least 50 games and best win rate over 150 games. I think it's important to note, of course, that this is not all of the data for the year, but we did a very good job this year. There should be something like 101 challenges over the course of a year on Magic Online for Vintage, and I think we had 93 in the data set. So it's possible we missed maybe only 8 challenges over the course of the entire year. Hopefully that number will be 0 next year, as the Daybreak has graced us with extra data, extra public data. But for maybe the last year of actually having to watch full replays, very impressive. And shout out to the volunteers on the data team. It's not just me. Special shout out probably to Eric. Eric did a lot of Sundays by himself. So if you want to thank somebody for data, I would say give a big special thanks to Eric, as well as people like Nathan, Senpai in the beginning of the year, QQE. There's just plenty of people who stop in and help do replays and data over the course of the year. So thank you to them. And let's take a quick peek at the leaderboard for 2023. The player with the most challenge matches in 2023, Y Prince. This player is a Magic Online grinder for sure. He has put up a really impressive showing in Vintage this year. 585 challenge matches with a 57% win rate. So not only does Prince have the most matches played, but will also result in him having the most top 8s among any players for this data set. You'll see a lot of common names here in the most played list. Obviously, you'll see them in every challenge that they can play. Echo Baron, Medvedev, Discoveran, Unlucky Monkey. These players are in every challenge. I'm down there at 14th, but it's actually not too bad considering I don't usually play Sunday challenges, and some of these players are true grinders and in both challenges every weekend. So congrats to Prince on not only being the most matches in challenges, but also the most top 8s. I guess that does technically help. If you have the most top 8s, you are going to play more matches, right? So that does help. But yeah, 23 top 8s in my data set. There probably are more top 8s for them, but I'm missing a couple challenges. But here you have the most played, so the top 8s. Some of the same names actually as the players who have the most played. So Prince, Baron, Monkey, Mog, Discoveran, Musasavi. These players have the most top 8s on Magic Online this year. And then let's take a quick peek at win rates. The player with the highest win rate with at least 50 games played, 127 games, 67.7% win rate. Diem, Bart, actually beats out Discovery this year in this category. Discovery is a common winner for this one on Magic Online. But you also have Italian PO expert, Ciofo, Shere Khan. You have the Mox qualifier winner, Moon Madness. Only 54 matches played in the dataset, but a nice solid 63% win rate. Lots of really powerful names on this list. If we condense this list to only players who have played 150 games, there are not that many players who have played 150 games on Magic Online. I think something a little bit over 50, if I recall correctly. But here are your top players for players who have over 150 games played in Vintage this year. And now Discovery reclaims his throne. 63.3% win rate over 477 games. Obviously, some very powerful wizards here. Monkey, Shere Khan, Cherry, Sprouts, Duke. Sprouts and Duke are players who continually have extremely high win rates in Vintage. Mog, creator of the Blue-Black Luris deck, profited heavily from that. You even got no props down here. And then, of course, actually, in this list, 9th in terms of win rate is Prince. So that's pretty impressive in my mind. So congratulations to those players for their leaderboard awards for Vintage on Magic Online in 2023. And congratulations to anyone who felt like they had a successful year on Magic Online. It's always great to be able to battle all of you. And I look forward to seeing you again next year. Now, all right, a little bit of end of year awards. So many insane plays style. I'm going to do 2. I'm going to do deck of the year, and I'm going to do new card of the year. I'm going to go through the ones I think are reasonable options, and give you some, background on why I think those could be chosen. And then I'll, of course, ask you to comment in the comments below what you think was the deck of the year and the new card of the year. So, in terms of deck of the year, the one that's going to jump to everyone's brain right away is Luris Saga, because it is the best deck right now. A little bit of recency bias, I would say. But it's an important deck to talk about. Luris Saga is the defining deck of the ending of 2023. It is a deck that has an extremely high play rate right now. It's a deck that has an extremely high win rate right now. But it's not a deck that was played over the course of the whole year. Can you give deck of the year to a deck that was only really played in Q4? That's something that comes up a lot in these kind of awards. I don't know the answer, so it's going to be up to you to decide if that disqualifies it from contention. But Luris Saga, a deck that has benefited heavily from the printing of Lorien Revealed. It is a fair deck, a control deck in Vintage. The best deck in Vintage right now is a control deck. It's crazy. Even hard to think about even just a year ago. The dominant Saga decks were actually combo-oriented Tinker decks. And now we have these little bit blue-black, Esper, blue-white, controlling decks. Some of these are splashing green for things like Haywire Might. I'm very interested to see where Luris Saga goes over the course of 2024. There's a lot of room inside of the shell to kind of play some tech cards, so it'll be pretty interesting to see. I think that's definitely a front runner for a deck of the year just because of its recent extreme performance. But I know, can the deck of the year be the deck that wasn't even among the most played? We'll have to see. Another choice could be Coveted Jewel Combo Shops. Coveted Jewel Combo Shops was a menace for multiple months in the back half of the year and has been a continual predator of initiative-dominated metagames. Coveted Jewel, extremely powerful combo deck, and a deck that had a pretty reasonable full-year win rate. When you look at Coveted Jewel and you see its full-year win rate as the second most played deck and a 52.11% win rate, you could very easily make the argument that as the second most played deck and the second highest win rate, Coveted Jewel could be the deck of the year. A kind of surprise deck of the year choice, I think, would be something like Doomsday. Doomsday, kind of quietly the 4th most played deck of the year, and actually the 3rd best win rate among these high played decks. Doomsday was definitely more of a player in the front half of the year, but it still showed up in the back half of the year. It still was definitely part of the conversation. In the second half of the year, it was the 5th most played deck. But definitely more of the beginning part of the year was more of a Doomsday section. there was definitely some times where people were definitely talking about Doomsday being the best deck in the format, unbeatable deck. I was there with them. But is it the best deck of the year? I don't know. We have to probably also talk about Oath when you talk about this conversation. Now, Oath is not a deck that had a high win rate over the whole year, but it is the third most played deck. It was the deck that was the deck to beat at Eternal Weekend. The printing of Atraxa really shot Oath into the spotlight. However, it's worth noting that even in the beginning of the year, pre-Atraxa, one of the best decks in the first showcase of the year was Oath of Druids. And this was Oath of Druids without Atraxa. So actually a pretty fully encompassing year for Oath of Druids. A deck that probably can't be deck of the year, but definitely needs to be in the consideration is Initiative. Initiative was the most played deck of the year. It didn't have a high win rate, but it had such a substantial play rate. It had by far the most played deck, and it was kind of the metagame driver in a sense, where the decks that did really well this year typically were decks that preyed on Initiative being the most played deck. So whether it can't really be the best deck of the year or the deck of the year, but it definitely is a story of the year or a driver of the year, or I don't know, maybe there does need to be 2 awards. Maybe Steve and Kevin are right in that sense. And then another thing to think about is Beseech. Beseech is almost a revived, brand new / revived archetype inside of Vintage. There wasn't really a Storm deck for a while now. You could kind of say the classic PO decks were a bit Storm decks, but they don't really even play Storm cards all the time. So the revival of a Storm deck is an interesting point. For me, I think I would have to say... I would probably say Jewel. I would say Jewel is the deck of the year. Not the best deck of the year, but the deck of the year. I find it hard to give this kind of award to Lurrus Saga when it's only been a deck for not even half a year. I definitely can understand anyone who would say Lurrus Saga is the deck of the year, but to me, I would say Jewel. It had consistent play rate over the whole year, put up a very substantial win rate, and definitely had people talking about, is Jewel too good? So I would go with Jewel, but I wouldn't blame anyone for picking Saga here. I definitely think there are like some compelling arguments for things like Doomsday Oath, and even Initiative. But for me, deck of the year, coveted Jewel, combo shops. New card of the year. There are, I would say, 5 major cards that were introduced to the Vintage format this year. The number one in my book probably is going to be my choice, Lorien Revealed. Now, Lorien Revealed, it's got its main focus in the deck Lurrus Saga, but I think Lorien Revealed pushes way past Lurrus Saga and encompasses way more decks than you would think. Lorien Revealed is a key component of turning Urza Saga and off-color Moxen mana bases into blue-producing mana bases, and not only blue-producing mana bases, but blue-producing mana bases that have enough blue cards for Force of Will. I did a whole video on Lorien. It was definitely worth its own video, and it is just impressive and to see this common basically change the entire format. Really kind of the glue that holds some of these decks together. Lorien Revealed would definitely be my front runner, but there are definitely some other options here. My second option I would present would be Atraxa. Now, Atraxa is a bit of a narrow choice, but Atraxa basically pushed an entire archetype to the forefront of the format. Oath of Druids was the deck to beat at Eternal Weekend, all 3 Eternal Weekends, and that is because of Atraxa. Atraxa kind of changed the way Oath was played. Oath used to be more of a controlling deck, more of an answers deck. Now Oath is a threats deck. Oath is playing show and tell, and we are jamming some large Phyrexian Angels into play. I think the effect of Atraxa on Oath and then the effect of Oath on the metagame was really, really apparent over the course of the year. Atraxa, a big player. That one, I guess, also got its own video. If you haven't checked out the Voice of Vintage on Atraxa, where I say Atraxa is the best creature in all of Magic, strongest creature in all of Magic. I think that one aged pretty well. Let's talk about Beseech. Beseech the Mirror. Now, Beseech the Mirror, kind of like Atraxa, is a one archetype card. Beseech the Mirror has revived Storm in Vintage, and that I think is a really awesome thing. When people think about Vintage, they think about turn 1 kills and Storm kills, and for a while there wasn't actually a Storm deck in Vintage, and now we have it back. Beseech actually had a very quietly good year, preying heavily on the Oath Initiative metagame, and Beseech was a major player towards the end of the year for sure. I think it's, probably a little narrower than Atraxa, because Beseech has never been the deck to beat in the format, and probably never will be the deck to beat in the format. But the fact that a Storm is back in Vintage is a pretty big ribbon on Beseech's jacket there. I also have a pair of Lord of the Rings cards here to talk about for new card of the year. I have the One Ring. Now, the One Ring, kind of an interesting one, because the One Ring was a card that came out with a lot of fanfare. One Ring, is it going to be broken? Is it going to be restricted in Vintage? I mean, not an unreasonable assumption to make, considering it is a card that can be cast off of Mishra's Workshop. And the One Ring did change and push Vintage forward, but kind of an interesting way. Initially, when the One Ring was printed, there were lots and lots of dedicated ring decks. People looking to use the ring as a controlling element, make a deck around the ring. But the ring is it's a little fragile. It's not fragile in the sense you can destroy it, because it's indestructible. But there's a lot of things in Vintage that stop it from doing its magic. It has an activated ability and is an artifact, so it's already weak to things like Null Rod and Collect Roof, things like Needle. And then it's drawing cards, and there are a lot of different kinds of draw hate in Vintage right now with Orcish Bowmaster and Hullbreacher. What the One Ring really did was made Jewel a more convincing choice. Before the One Ring, Jewel was a little bit lacking in consistent threat deployment. But the One Ring gives you the 8 really powerful colorless threats with the rings and jewels. And so I think the One Ring is probably a huge contributor to Jewel's success. And if you consider Jewel to be maybe the deck of the year, maybe you have to consider the One Ring to be the new card of the year. The other Lord of the Rings card that made a splash onto the format is Orcish Bowmaster. And Orcish Bowmaster is a card that is not in all Lurrus Saga decks now, but for a while was the prevailing, mascot card, I guess, of Lurrus Saga. I don't think it's the most important card in Lurrus Saga. It's definitely a card that you can play around with, maybe changing, but it's definitely a consistent threat and does a powerful thing. The problem is, it how powerful? It's not a Hullbreacher, right? Your opponent is still drawing cards, but maybe the clock established by Bowmaster pings is enough. It would, in my mind, I don't think Bowmaster fits this list to the same degree as some of these other cards. I guess you could say it's a major player in Lurrus Saga's bid for deck of the year, but I think it's like much less impactful than a card like Lorien Revealed. So Lorien Revealed, Atraxa, the One Ring, and Bowmaster. Those are your 5 cards I think made significant impacts on the Vintage format this year. If I had to make a choice, I would probably vote Lorien Revealed. I think Lorien Revealed has a multiple deck impact in a substantial way. Atraxa, Beseech, the One Ring, and Bowmaster are all kind of one deck cards, where Lorien Revealed is just a blue card, which does make it, that's a little unfair, don't you think? But yeah, so I would say Lorien Revealed, and then I would probably be a little bit biased, but I would say my runner-up would be Atraxa. I think that while Atraxa is a one deck card, it also influenced the metagame extremely heavily by making that deck the deck to beat inside of Eternal Weekend. So there you have it. My picks are going to be deck of the year, coveted Jewel combo shops, and new card of the year, Lorien Revealed. Make sure you let me know that I'm wrong down in the comments. Give me your deck of the year, your new card of the year. And thank you. Thank you for your continued support of this channel. Thank you for your continued support of the Vintage format. I don't get to continue doing this as long as Vintage... I only get to continue doing this as long as Vintage exists. So thank you for showing your support in both either playing or watching or anything in between. I do plan to be doing this again next year. So hopefully I will see you for more vintage action in 2024. New videos on my channel, gameplay videos, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'll see you then.